Hi, this is SOW Extra, and I'm Theodore Ross, Editor-in-Chief of the Food and Environment Reporting Network, or FERN. I'm here today with regular, I should even say frequent or stalwart FERN contributor, Boyce Upholt, and we're going to talk about Boyce's new podcast episode on SOW. It's called Something Fishy. Uh, Welcome to SOW, Boyce. We're glad to have you here again.
Thanks, Ted. Glad to be here.
Yeah, so this is a really modern story about a modern kind of fraud, that is seafood fraud. Now, this is something that maybe people have heard a little bit about, maybe they've read about it in the news somewhere, but basically, you're going to go into a restaurant or a food or seafood supplier, you ask for the locally caught, locally produced seafood, whatever that may be, and in fact, it turns out that it is not that thing. It is from somewhere else and has been raised in ways that you just don't necessarily know are good or bad. And that is what the story is all about. Uh, Boyce, why don't you take us into the basics of the story and tell us the first question that we have on all of these, which is why this story?
Yeah, I feel like as a consumer myself, I've sort of had this ambient sense that potentially I'm eating seafood that is not local without it being told that. I think we all have kind of heard these stories about how many imports we eat in America now and not being clear about where the seafood comes from. But what really hit me was a really big court case over in Mississippi. It's just a couple hours from where I live in New Orleans, where a very prominent restaurant that I had known about for years was pursued by the federal government under accusations of serving seafood fraudulently. So it was a rare case where this was not just sort of chatter about how seafood was fraudulent, but the government actually stepping in to do something about it. And so that restaurant is called Mary Mahoney's Old French House. It's in Biloxi, Mississippi. And at the center of the narrative in this piece is sort of what they did and why, but also how the community reacted to that fact.
Yeah, so I just want to say that this is a particularly interesting and important story for me personally. You may not be able to hear this from my accent because I also grew up in New York, but much of my childhood, half of my childhood, was spent on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, in Biloxi, and in Gulfport, Mississippi. I have been to Mary Mahoney's a million times. I've also been to the seafood provider, in this case, Quality Poultry and Seafood. In fact, all right, so I'm going to point out a little bit of swag I have here. So first of all, this is my Fern News baseball hat, which is nice. But this t-shirt, this is not a Mary Mahoney's t-shirt, but it is Little Ray's, which is a local, for all you Biloxi and Gulfport people out there who may end up or may end up not watching this or listening to this. Very good po' boys, very good local oysters, and who knows if they're local either. Although I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt and say that they are. So you bring up a really interesting point, and it gets to our second question, and I'm curious to hear what you say about it. I mean, one of the things about the court case with Mary Mahoney's was this news came out that they had been found guilty of this fraud and they paid this fine. And locally, people just didn't seem to care, right? It wasn't that they were, they weren't happy that the seafood that they were getting at Mary Mahoney's, the red snapper or whatever, or the shrimp was from somewhere else, but they reacted to it more like it was something that it was being done to Mary Mahoney's than it was something that Mary Mahoney's was doing to them. And I'm curious if that impacted your reporting, and maybe you could tell me what the biggest obstacle to your reporting was.
Yeah, I mean that definitely shaped the reporting. It shaped the story I wanted to tell because like the stories I was hearing from people in town was like after Mary Mahoney's had been raided back in 2019, and sort of there was this show of support immediately afterwards where they were booked out for reservations immediately. And then 5 years later, when sort of the full details came out, still there was sort of this wave of support on Facebook, and that made me really curious. It was actually interesting and useful to be able to talk with you, Ted, about what Biloxi used to be like, because I had first visited in 2018, and so I had seen it only in this era where this fraud was already happening. And part of what I was curious about was this town that calls itself the seafood capital of the world. How do we get to this place that you've got consumers that are saying, it's kind of shrugging in the face of seafood fraud and saying, we care more about this restaurant. And to your point, the big challenge was nobody wanted to talk to me, right? The Mahoney's family is a big deal in Biloxi because Mary Mahoney's is a big deal. It's sort of this symbol of what Biloxi used to be, and maybe isn't anymore. That this sort of old Southern place steeped in tradition that is changing so much. This is a town that allows casinos now. It has been through so many hurricanes. And so I think some of the attachment to this restaurant and the sort of shrugging at the fraud had to do with the way Mahoney's symbolized sort of the old identity of Biloxi that is changing so much in the past few years.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting part of the story, and it's something you and I talked about a lot as you were reporting it and writing it, is the food culture of the Gulf Coast. It's an interesting thing because on the one hand, it's really distinct. The food that you get down in Gulfport and Biloxi and Pass Christian and Long Beach and Ocean Springs, all the towns, Bay St. Louis, all the towns of the Gulf Coast is unique, right? When I go home, I'm going to go home and visit my mother in Gulfport in a couple of weeks, and I'm going to go have some po' boys, catfish po' boy, crab meat po' boy. I'm going to have some crawfish. I'm going to have raw oysters. I'm going to have fried shrimp. I'm going to do all the things, the gumbo, fried dill pickles, which I don't think is unique to Biloxi, but it's definitely good. All of those things exist on the coast, and people are very proud of them and they like to eat it. But on the other hand, I don't know that they value it in the way that you might expect. One of my stronger memories of the last, say, 15 years or so on the coast has been the entry of national chains on restaurants on the coast, and not just, you know, pizza places or a, you know, Olive Garden or whatever, seafood restaurants, chain seafood restaurants coming in. I remember, and this place went away after Hurricane Katrina and didn't come back, but there was a Red Lobster on the Gulf Coast. Red Lobster serving seafood from all over the world on the Gulf Coast of Mississippi, and it was super, super, super popular. What do you think about it? What do you make of the food culture? You talk to all these chefs, like the people at the White Pillars, which is another iconic restaurant there. Where is that disconnect that comes in for this pride for this really distinct food culture and maybe the way they sort of take it for granted too?
Yeah, that Red Lobster is interesting because I was trying to the best way I could find to sort of track the changing food culture was to look at newspaper archives and see kind of when were some of these big chains first being mentioned and appearing, and a lot of them came in the tail end of casino legalization in the 1990s, and then
Yeah.
Hurricane Katrina, like these big events that were reshaping the economy, opened the space for these big national chains. And a food writer for the local paper wrote a review of Red Lobster, just being like, "Well, I go there because it's like great seafood done well," and it was just so ironic to me and captured what I think was sort of like there's these two parallel stories in Biloxi, right? One is economic change and natural change due to hurricanes, due to rising oceans. That was one force, and then sort of in parallel was the globalization of the seafood economy, which was totally reshaping this former seafood capital. So all these shrimpers are finding it harder and harder to work and to compete against imports coming from abroad, and so that's just disappearing. And it just sort of becomes this feedback loop, right? Because you get as you get fewer and fewer shrimpers, you have fewer and fewer people that actually go out on the water. You have fewer and fewer people that know shrimpers. You have fewer and fewer people that feel a real connection with the product itself. Those recipes remain, and those are the things that people are used to eating, but there isn't sort of this same notion of like, well, I know who brought this shrimp to shore. I know how it gets to my plate. And so I think people became more and more attached to the dishes themselves without thinking about, does it matter where the seafood in the dish comes from?
I think it's a really interesting point. I mean, if you think about Mary Mahoney's itself, it's on the street. There's a highway, a beach highway that runs the length of the Gulf Coast and beyond, Highway 90, and that's where Mary Mahoney's is. It's right on the inland side of the highway, and right across the street is the beach, right, and the water. There used to be there still is there the small craft harbor where people, you know, the shrimpers come in and out, the few that are remaining, but many of what was once there, you know, the shrimping is mostly gone, and then directly across from Mary Mahoney's is the Hard Rock Casino, right? So we're talking about a place that has seen a lot of its more recent culture and history go away, and Mary Mahoney's is hanging on. It's still there. Even if the food maybe seems a little bit not so contemporary, people do care about it still. And I'm curious, when you come there as somebody who's never been there before, what I just wonder what your impression is of a place like that, because it's not exactly the old South. It doesn't look like the old South. It's a gambling town, and it used to be like an illegal drinking town. I just want to hear your impressions as somebody who came there to write about it. And and before we talk about that, I just want to mention the one thing we didn't get into the piece. And you only talked about killing your babies. You talk a lot about the history of shrimp, but you didn't talk about mullet. And it's my favorite nickname for the mullet industry in Biloxi, which is Biloxi bacon. So I
Yeah.
just wanted to get that out there.
I didn't talk about it. It's hard to find. In all the trips I've been to Biloxi, I don't think I've ever had the opportunity
Yeah,
to eat Biloxi bacon. But
yeah, that's right.
my introduction to Biloxi was an interesting one. I think this was one of the very first magazine stories I ever wrote back in 2013 ish. Was an assignment for Mississippi Magazine where they sent me down to write about the sort of a colorful, romantic story about the shrimp industry in Biloxi, but it was sort of set up through one of the seafood distributors, and so the photographer and I were put up in the Hard Rock Casino, and so from day one, I got this sort of sense of contrast of, we spent the night in a casino hotel and then went out and sort of did a fake shrimping tour by sunset, and then came back and went to a dive bar and had drinks and food, and so we were seeing all these different pieces. I think I go back to the Mississippi coast quite a bit, and you mentioned it's not the old South, or it doesn't. That's not the immediate thing, but there is sort of Jefferson Davis's retirement home is there. It's this important symbol of this place. You go to Mary Mahoney's, and it has sort of an ancient live oak out front. It has this. They talk about how the building is from the 1700s, which is not true. It's another piece of like sort of mythologizing there, and so that is what makes the place so fascinating. Fascinating is the way myths layer on myths of like there is pride in the gambling history of this town, and there's pride in the old South history, and there's pride in the seafood industry, but they all have just sort of become stories that the town is trying to present as it more and more becomes sort of this retirement and tourism centered community.
Yeah, I mean, that's all true. I want us to sort of end with some of that notion around the culture there in mind when I ask you the final question, which is, what's the takeaway from this story? What do you think that we should be learning from this very richly reported narrative?
Yeah, I mean, I've been on a sort of on the seafood beat now for a while, and part of what it motivates me there is sort of this question of what are we going to do in this part of the world where I live, and I think everywhere too, right? Is more and more of our food is being moved across the world. It's not local, and yet in this place, the identity is built on this idea of localness, and so it's less a take like the takeaway is not necessarily an answer, but there's some questions that I keep asking and that I think we need to ask is sort of what do we want culture here to look like, food culture, our relationship to the ocean. If we just leave it untouched, what we're going to get is more of the same, of more and more people moving out of the seafood business, more and more of our food being quote local recipes but not made with local products, and there are some real I touched in the piece about sort of efforts to do more testing for fraud, a wave of new laws trying to ensure that restaurants have to market their seafood appropriately, and so hopefully that to me I hope that will make a difference, right? And so we're in this sort of precarious moment. A lot of shrimpers are saying if we don't change something, this business is gone. There's just not enough money in it, and so hopefully we can build on those changes and ensure that there are other things that make restaurants stay honest and maybe help this tradition stay alive.
All right, I like that. I mean, I'm going to leave it at that. And I just want to tell people a little bit of information about the story. So if you want to listen to the podcast, and I really hope you do, it's available on ReapSo, which is FERN's audio platform. You can also listen to it on YouTube. Our home on YouTube for FERN is at FERN News. You can also check it out wherever you get your podcasts, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, whatever. It's also available from our partners on this project, the good folks at the Gravy Podcast from the Southern Foodways Alliance. We partner with them on it. You should check out their great reporting, not just Boyce's. They have a lot of great stuff doing their stories on what they call stories of the changing South. And it's always changing. And finally, the other thing I wanted to mention, this story is part of something that we do a lot of at FERN, which is stories in multiple forms. So there is the podcast version of this. There's also Boyce's really, really good long form text story, which is in print and online at Ink Magazine. So you should check that out too. Last thing, if you want to learn more about FERN's dispatches from the front lines of food, farming, and the environment, or if you want to donate to support our work, go to www.thefern.org. Thanks very much.